Back before there was a 1619 project, before there was such a thing as critical race theory, Americans were blessed with a steady stream of extraordinary African American statesmen and citizens who upheld and deepened American liberty. That's what we're going to talk about today on this edition of Independent Outlook. Welcome to everybody who's with us today. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. We're right across the bay from San Francisco, and our goal is to bring you something of an independent perspective on events of the day, and in this case, events in history. To help us do that today, I am delighted to welcome two colleagues and friends as our guests. First of all, Dr. Williamson M, who is the director of Independent Institute's Center on Educational Excellence and a very accomplished political scientist. Welcome, Dr. Evers. It's a pleasure to have you. And for today's topic in particular, we're especially pleased to have Dr. Jonathan Bean with us. Dr. Bean is a research fellow here at the Independent Institute, also a professor of history at Southern Illinois University. He is the author of this remarkable book, which was published by Independent a few years back, called Race and Liberty in America, The Essential Reader, which I highly recommend. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. Several other books as well. To your credit, I believe, Dr. Bean, you have been a member of the Illinois Advisory Panel for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Your work, op-eds and essays, has appeared in places like NPR, CBS News, U.S. News and World Report, Newsweek, Business Week, Forbes, Chronicle of Higher Education, Mother Jones, Salon. I mean, you're published everywhere. So welcome, Jonathan Bean.
It's great to be here, Graham.
So glad you're here. Yeah. So we don't mind, we won't doctor one another. We don't mind calling one another by our first names, Bill and John. Pleasure to have both of you here. So let me just kind of set our conversation up a little bit today. Thinking about this, I can't help realizing some people may wonder, why are three older guys with fairly pale complexions so interested in Black history? Well, there are many reasons, but primarily because we are, all of us, not just us three, but we're all deeply indebted to the pantheon of distinguished Americans who have contributed to liberty and prosperity in quite a number of ways, and who also happen to derive their ancestry, at least in part, from Africa. So I want to recognize that debt and give honor to whom honor is due. That's basically why we're doing this. And for example, I consider myself very much in debt to the brilliant Frederick Douglass, who was both slavery's most potent foe and the U.S. Constitution's most profound defender, in my view. More on that in a minute. Of course, there are also less happy reasons for paying attention to Black history in America, and that's because in recent decades, and especially recent years, the subject of race has become contested, controverted, controversial in some regrettably divisive ways. One thinks of the New York Times' 1619 project, race-based quotas, critical race theory, etc. We'll come back to some of that stuff in a little bit, but let's set that aside for starters here and just reflect back on the legacy of some of these great leaders. Now, in your book, Race and Liberty in America, you have compiled a number of contributions from crucial African-American leaders in the past, as well as others who spoke to the question of race and liberty. Kind of going back toward the beginning of things, one of the ones you mentioned early on in the book was James Fortin, who was an inspiration to Frederick Douglass. Can you tell us anything about Mr. Fortin?
James Fortin he was a Revolutionary War veteran. He was the son of a free Black. His grandfather was a slave entrepreneur who purchased his own freedom and the freedom of his family.
So by slave entrepreneur, you mean even as a slave, he could work as a businessman?
Yes.
To clarify.
There was the phenomena of slaves who had a particular skill set that their masters wanted to employ and profit from. And part of the negotiation was to purchase their own freedom in the end. And that's one good example of it. So James Fortin, the story is very brief. He fought in the Revolutionary War. He had a very successful sail-making business in Philadelphia, where there are a number of successful Blacks in the early 19th century. He hired both Blacks and whites, and he pointed to his workforce and said, this is the future of America. This is what we need to do. But he also fought against laws that were going to greatly restrict the liberty of free Blacks in Pennsylvania.
So because Blacks were fleeing from the South and people were emancipating their slaves, or slaves were buying their own freedom, some of the white workers said, oh, there's too much competition. We need to suppress competition. So we need to control inflow of black labor, and we need to control the free black labor within Pennsylvania. And so our guy we're talking about now said, hey, no, these people should be just as free and have the same rights of employment and economic activity as the whites. I think the fascinating thing about him is his whole relation to the colonization movement. So, you know, and people thought, well, we have these slaves and we have these freed blacks, and maybe they should be invited voluntarily, or some people, you know, thought, let's force them to go back to Africa. And in the beginning, so as Jonathan was saying, he was a very successful businessman. And so he supported some people that were trying to do some of this colonization, but it became controversial, and he joined with some church leaders in setting up a meeting, a community meeting, and he discovered that no blacks were in favor of going back to Africa. They all wanted to make their way in the United States, but, you know, there's obstacles. They could see the social and sometimes legal obstacles, but that's what they wanted to do. And the key thing, the key thing of his life is he persuaded William Lloyd Garrison. First of all, he funded William Lloyd Garrison because he was so rich. He funded the newspaper, well, the Liberator of William Lloyd Garrison. But not only that, he persuaded William Lloyd Garrison, who was a brilliant polemicist, to oppose colonization. Jonathan.
And I think the important point with lesson with Fortin and with many of the other figures we'll talk about, and I talk about in the book, is that business, capitalism, was on the side of African Americans.
Right.
And the same thing would be true when immigrants came to America. Labor unions were opposed, progressives were opposed, and the business community for 200 years was on the side of African Americans' right to work, and was on the side of the immigrants.
Exactly.
I want to also note that James Fortin has this wonderful essay in your book, John. Independence Day belongs to all Americans in 1813. Was it a speech or a pamphlet? What was it?
It was a letter or a pamphlet that he circulated to stop the registration of blacks in Pennsylvania. People were going to have to register themselves. And there was a police element here because the police could apprehend someone they thought was a fugitive slave if they didn't have registration.
As an undocumented black.
An undocumented black. And of course, this would just incentivize the illegal kidnapping of blacks in Pennsylvania. And that bill was defeated, but
because of his pamphlet.
Because of his pamphlet. And this is very timely because in that essay, Graham, in Race and Liberty, he begins by drawing upon our glorious Constitution, he called it, and the Declaration of Independence. And on the one hand, he cries against the injustice being done to blacks. On the other hand, he said that these founding documents are the inspiration for our civil rights struggle. And that's a theme right to the present day, even though projects like the 1619 Project would have us reject those founding documents as being influential.
Different approach. And Fortin, as I think you point out in the book, and as others have noted, Fortin was also an inspiration for the great Frederick Douglass. We have a remarkable set of resources available on our website, which Bill Evers, I think you've been involved in creating, The Crisis in Civil Rights, the best books and articles and so forth on race, the police, the welfare
state. And that's Frederick Douglass right there.
And I wanted you to see this picture. Yeah, Frederick Douglass. I mean, what an incredible man. If you go to the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, there's another portrait lately painted of him. I think it's the most powerful portrait in the whole museum. His countenance was penetrating, really. And he had penetrating things to say. Which of you wants to talk about Frederick Douglass first?
Well, Jonathan, why don't you kick off? But I want to make sure I say something about a certain edition of his speeches.
Okay, we'll come back to your edition. Yeah. John, go ahead.
Well, so as many viewers know, Frederick Douglass was a fugitive slave, self-educated. Just his speeches are of the highest caliber. he, along with Lewis Marshall, a Jewish American lawyer, have the greatest number of documents in my book. People are aware of his 4th of July oration, in which he denounces the hypocrisy of white Americans, but he ends by drawing upon the Constitution as a glorious liberty document. Now, last summer during Black Lives Matter protests online, there was a video of young people reading Frederick Douglass's 4th of July oration and his denunciation of white America. And that circulated very widely, got millions of hits. Well, they end where he was just getting started. The second half of his speech is a vindication of the Constitution as a glorious liberty document.
Right.
He broke with William Lloyd Garrison over whether or not the Constitution was a pro-slavery or anti-slavery document. And
so William Lloyd Garrison, sort of like the 1619 people, was very worried that things were tainted from the beginning, and whereas Douglass, like Fortin, thought, no, within the natural rights, individual rights, freedom, tradition that you can see in the Declaration of Independence, you can see in the Constitution, there's the potential to realize rights, to broaden the exercise of existing rights. And that's what Douglass turned to. And he and Lysander Spooner and the leaders of the Liberty Party of that day argue that the Constitution could be seen as pushing for the emancipation of slaves, interpreted in a certain way. And so Douglass, from the time he turned away from the William Lloyd Garrison, and Jonathan and I are not, we don't hate William Lloyd Garrison or anything like that. He did a wonderful contribution to the anti-slavery movement. But we're trying to say is that he sometimes had a kind of a council of despair about whether you could turn American institutions, whether you could turn the American public, whether you could turn the churches. And one of the great things about Douglass is that he didn't despair. And he, so.
Well, it's revealing that the 1619 Project and the curriculum materials that they've sent out to public schools, sort of an Afrocentric approach to the teaching of U.S. history, leaves out Frederick Douglass.
I know, it's amazing.
It's absolutely remarkable, because he's problematic for their agenda.
Right. And this is what I wanted to mention about. So there's several collections of Frederick Douglass's speeches. And so I always recommend the Yale University Press one, but there's another one called From the Library of Black America. And so it leaves out the speech, "Let the Negro Alone," and the self-made man. So Douglass, of course, is for emancipation. He's for letting enslaved people become freed people. But he also thinks the important thing is to get out of the way of blacks making their own lives, making their own prosperity, making their own culture, making their families flourish. And he thinks that too much paternalism, too much telling blacks what to do, too much, trying to make them dependents in some other way will harm their creativity and their living their own lives of dignity and decency. And so he spoke out against that. And so the Yale edition says, this is historically part of what he believed. We're putting it in. The Library of Black America thought, this is politically incorrect. We're not going to put these in.
It may not be in the Yale edition, but it's in Race and Liberty in America, my anthology.
Right.
It was the speech that he delivered the most in his life.
Yes.
It was called Self-Made Men. He gave it first in the 1850s.
He did. You are exactly
he gave it
right.
in 1893. He gave it to Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute. So there was no contradiction between fighting for racial justice, tearing down barriers, but at the same time preaching self-help.
Right.
Booker T. Washington does the same thing in Race and Liberty. We remember him as the gospel of self-made men and self-reliance, but he also spoke out against racial injustice.
Right. And one of the hidden themes of Black history is that W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, behind the scenes, actually had almost the exact same views. So one pushed, fight, struggle, we have to push back, we're being oppressed. The other pushed self, so that's Du Bois. Booker T. Washington pushed self-help, learn a trade, get economic advancement for our community. But behind the scenes, Booker T. Washington was also pushing for civil rights, pushing for, rolling back Black codes of various sorts. And on the opposite side, Du Bois was also in favor of people learning a trade, becoming self-supporting, and so forth. So they really kind of had different rhetorical strategies and different donors. And so that was an interesting paradox that isn't often acknowledged in history.
Coming back briefly to the contrast between Douglass and Garrison. I mean, Garrison's the one who went around the country burning the Constitution,
right,
or copies of it, saying that it was a pact with Satan, whereas Frederick Douglass said that in this document exists the seeds of the liberty and equality and justice for which every human being is best suited. He wrote a couple of incredible autobiographies, and I would certainly recommend his 1855, My Bondage and My Freedom. I read that years ago and had a huge impact on me.
They're both excellent, really.
Yeah, really, they really are.
It's
So, okay, let's just, there's so many more. We were going to talk about Ida B. Wells. Can either of you comment on her? I heard that she was pro Second Amendment. Is that true?
Yes. There's a great line from one of her things where she says, a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every Black home. So I don't think you can get any more explicit than that. So she was obviously for Black self-defense, any individual self-defense. So her primary fame is as an anti-lynching crusader and a journalist, telling about lynching incidents that were going on. So as you would think, so lynching is curbside justice, it's vigilante justice, and obviously many accused were not guilty and were summarily executed without people looking at the evidence and scrutinizing it and so forth. And so many Blacks were killed by this. Some whites were killed by this too, but it was a serious problem. And she was hugely influential in her time. She was certainly the most prominent Black of her time. And she was for human rights above everything. When she found the Republican Party, which all Blacks in her time really pretty much belonged to the Republican Party, when she found that they were, equivocating or sometimes allying with people who were suppressing Black rights in the South, she said, okay, I'll run as an independent. So she was really a principled person and indefatigable.
Comments on her?
Yeah. And she took the lead early on as a Black woman with writings like Southern Horrors. The lynching gets a fair amount of attention in Race and Liberty. There's a number of documents. Booker T. Washington, he was influential not just in speaking publicly against lynching, but his Tuskegee Institute did a very good job tracking the number of lynchings, and that became useful data for congressmen in the 1910s and 1920s who were passing laws, federal anti-lynching bills, to get and eradicate this problem.
Actually, the Democrats would never let those bills get out.
Well, in the 1920s, it passed twice in the House of Representatives with Republicans in control.
Right.
The Senate the Democrats filibuster. You're correct, Bill.
Right.
And
so this persists even farther into the 20th century. I mean, it even persists now with kind of a flipped situation, but it's interesting. The Democrats would say, oh, we're interfering with local law enforcement. And the Republicans would say, no, this is civil rights. This is part of the 14th Amendment. These people are not receiving due process. And Republicans generally, up through, say, the 1930s, argue that blacks are kind of a special case because they were enslaved, because they are emancipation from that condition of slavery. The federal government needs to watch out for their rights. And so this whole controversy over lynching and so forth was part of that.
John, I'm looking again at the table of contents of this wonderful compilation. We're on some of the greats of the past. Who else would you like to draw our attention to, maybe in the period before World War I or in there?
Kelly Miller. He's still looking for his biographer. Kelly Miller was he was an African American. He got a master's, I believe, at Johns Hopkins University in math, the first African American to do so. He became dean of Howard University, the very prestigious historically black institution. But he was a commentator. He was the most widely read black writer in the early 1900s, certainly in the 1920s. He had a syndicated column, Kelly Miller Says, that was read by 500,000, mostly African Americans and black newspapers all over the country. He was studiously independent. W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, they both curried his favor, but he was never a partisan. So viewers can Google Kelly Miller on Google Books and find his essays, like the essay Radicals and Conservatives, trying to explain to a European that there were radical blacks and there were conservative blacks. And the Europeans saying, well, what do they have to be conservative about? As America went to war in 1917, countries segregated. Woodrow Wilson has segregated the government. There was a massacre of African Americans in East St. Louis, the same month we went to war. He published a piece called Disgrace of Democracy, which he dedicated to Woodrow Wilson, circulated 250,000 copies, including among black troops in France fighting World War I. And at the end of the war, he wrote a book, The World War for Human Rights. I think that was the title. And it's a history of human rights and the aspirations of people around the world. And he argues that the world is or should be heading towards unity, not diversity. That we need to appreciate what we have in common and not that which divides us, which of course is a contradiction of the current diversity liberalism, which turns that on its head.
Right.
He's an amazing figure, and I heartily recommend his writings.
Okay, so if there are any history graduate students watching, pay attention.
There's work that could be done.
There's a dissertation for you. There's a book.
So Jonathan brought up Woodrow Wilson and how he segregated the government, and this is actually very important for a history of progressivism and for black history. So, basically, the Republicans had dominated the presidency from Lincoln through Wilson. There was Grover Cleveland, but it was, everybody was a Republican except for that. So the civil service and the diplomatic corps and so forth had scattering of blacks. And so Wilson... As
a result of the Republican ascendancy during that period. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And, some Northern Democrats were for this too. But basically it was the Republicans. So Wilson had his own sort of he had arguments from social science, behavioral science, and from his Hegelian concept of history, and the Anglo-Saxons somehow taking the spirit of the Weltgeist, whatever. And so, he loved the movie, he loved the great movie based on the Klansman. He showed it there in the White House. And he wrote in his own History of the United States various racist things, and so he segregated the civil service, and he dropped the people who were like blacks who were like diplomats in Haiti or one place or another, and some held positions in the customs service or various different positions in the post office, whatever. He either gave, if they had high posts, he ended that, and if they were lower clerk type people, they had to be in segregated setting. But for blacks and education, so there was a controversy, and the people we just talked about, W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, are involved in this controversy. So the question is, should blacks be trained to be workers, or sometimes skilled workers, or should at least some blacks be trained academically to hold professional positions? So the position, at least the public position, of Booker T. Washington and the Wilson administration and certain foundations was that blacks and light industry people in the South, so white businessmen, was that blacks should be trained to be carriers of water, hewers of wood, so forth, but maybe skilled, but not really be trained for academic positions. The position of W.B. Du Bois, so he was kind of a strange person ideologically. He was 1/3 communist, 1/3 Pan-Africanist, 1/3 Frederick Douglass libertarian. So you can imagine a crazy person like that. There was a real such person, and pretty influential. So anyway, so he argued that there was a talented tenth of blacks, that blacks had to have ministers and dentists and doctors and lawyers and so forth, and there should be pathways for blacks to get an academic education. But the Wilson administration opposed that. They subsidized, they promoted a book on Black Negro education, and they pushed for schools in the South to turn away from academic education.
Wow. So really, overall, the Wilson administration, which was the first major Democratic administration for quite a while, was a disaster for equality and for African-American access.
And black leaders originally supported Wilson, many of them, because they were hopeful that the Republicans had gotten kind of relaxed and complacent, and plus there were factions in the South called the Lily Whites versus the Black and Tans. This is a huge, complicated thing that Jonathan could explain better than I could. But the point is that in the South, the Republicans were divided, and the national Republican leaders would switch to one side or another, and the blacks would get frustrated with this. So a lot of them went with Wilson, even though historically everybody was a Republican hitherto.
So they were disappointed. In other words.
And they said so. Jonathan can maybe say something about that, but the top leaders protested vehemently to no avail. Jonathan? To the Wilson administration.
The thing, and after Wilson was gone, things did get better in the 1920s, at least in terms of the Republican Party leaders like Warren Harding, who was not normally the highest rated president in U.S. history. One of his
pretty good for blacks, though.
One of his first important addresses, which is in Race and Liberty, was in Birmingham, Alabama in 1921. And he went there and he argued, free the black vote, and we need to stop thinking about northern and southern votes, solid blocks of Democrats and Republicans, whether they're white votes or they're black votes. It really outraged southern racist Democrats. But got a lot of praise, of course, from black newspapers and from his Republican allies.
Jonathan, let's fast forward a bit. We were at Woodrow Wilson. Let's fast forward to the next great Democratic president, FDR. And during that era, among the notable African-American voices were those involved in the Harlem Renaissance, literarily, and especially Zora Neale Hurston, whom you feature in your book. You make this very tantalizing observation about her, that politically she was an anti-New Deal Republican. Can you explain?
Zora Neale Hurston, of course, is loved for her contribution to the Harlem Renaissance and her novels.
Yeah, rightly so.
Their Eyes Are Watching God was loved by Oprah. Feminists like her approach. She's definitely a strong female and a feminist, but she was an anti-New Deal Republican. And she advocated or expressed classical liberal principles when she supported people like Robert Taft after the war. There's a document in there telling her about doing that. She was opposed to the growing thinking of a welfare state. She thought this was a paternalism that would really hurt blacks, and not just blacks, whites as well. And she just thought that the country was heading down the wrong road. And above all, she fiercely denounced the whole talk of race pride, whether it was race pride by whites or blacks, which of course was increasingly common. Marcus Garvey in the 1920s into the 1930s, frankly, right to the present day. And in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on the Road, which I think she wrote in 1941, she says that race classifications are meaningless, they're fallacious, and they're dangerous. You can't wallow in your own race pride and complain about it with others. And she and Douglass and others in the book make the case that all achievements are achievements of individuals.
Right.
It was George Washington Carver that discovered the magic of the peanut. It wasn't Black America. It was Albert Einstein that understood theory of relativity. It wasn't Jewish Americans. And so, and not only individual excellence belonging or being attributed to individuals, but that these achievements can be claimed by all. We shouldn't be, if you're interested in Black achievements or achievements of Black individuals, it's perfectly fine, and if you're not Black, and vice versa. So she was very much an individualist, as were most of the people in the book.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating.
There's a few other things to just say here. One is that the New Deal itself was pretty anti-Black. I mean, it was designed when it came to housing laws, when it came to wage regulations, when it came to federal construction projects, to push Blacks out. It supported unions that were excluding Blacks, and in a strange way, it's rather odd that there was a big shift of voters from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. I think if I want to, first of all, the Democrats had good propagandists on this stuff, but the second thing is the Democrats supported federal relief, so federal aid to the poor, and the Republicans tended to think this was a state and local issue. So that may have been the tipping factor. But in terms of mistreatment of Blacks, including segregated in the World War II armed forces, that was not so great. Another thing that's important once we're talking about the Harlem Renaissance and the subsequent period is the issue of communism and socialism. So, so many of the people who we're going to talk about from now on, who were individualists or conservatives or classical liberals or however we want to call them, they were anti-communists. So there was a large element beginning in the Harlem Renaissance of leftism among Black intellectuals. And the people who opposed it, the people who thought socialism was maybe a new kind of slavery, certainly inducing dependence, that didn't think, that favored freedom, and they thought socialism was going to be the opposite of freedom. They tended to, have fights with the Black intellectuals that were pro-socialist. And this usually ended up hurting their popularity and their historic evaluation by later scholars who were also leftist. So I don't know, Jonathan, I think you should say something about that, because it seems to me that for a number of our people, beginning with the Franklin Roosevelt administration, we have to include that as something that figures in their fate.
Bill raises a good point about the communist activism and civil rights. It's a sad fact that Many historians today attribute civil rights progress to this communist participation in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. They call it the long civil rights project. And in essence, we wouldn't have these civil rights in part if it weren't for the contribution of communists. The problem with this is, as Bill indicates, Black Americans, including A. Philip Randolph, leader of the largest Black labor union, the railroad porters, George Schuyler, the wonderful novelist and the chief publicist for the NAACP, were staunchly anti-communist. But historians today have a predilection to favor leftist figures in the past. And so the mantra now is that the long civil rights movement began with the left and the labor movement and with communists. Of course, I disagree.
Yeah, that is.
It's certainly hard to make the case. I mean, Herbert Hill, who was the labor director for the NAACP, documented in article after article the discrimination and anti-Black attitudes and anti-other race attitudes of the main labor unions. It wasn't just the Blacks that got it. The Chinese and Japanese got it pretty bad too. So, this is a myth. This is some kind of pink or red myth that they're making about the past.
So let's fast forward a little bit.
So not only the progressives and Woodrow Wilson diminished the rights of Blacks and tried to push them down, but the labor unions did also. The communists did try and take advantage of various things like the Scottsboro Boys and things like that. But if you read, there's, Native Son is the most famous book by Richard Wright, but he wrote another one, Black Boy, if I remember it correctly, that is largely about experiencing manipulation by communists and what an unpleasant thing it is. Somehow that book, it isn't really quite as good as Native Son, but anyway, has very interesting information in it.
So fast forward, Great Society, which is the step 2 of the New Deal, you might say, and then the Civil Rights Movement. Obviously, it would be fair to say that maybe Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. were the 2 of the greatest of all of our African American statesmen. And Martin Luther King Jr., of course, he articulated the individual colorblind themes of Zora, Neale, Hurston, and others when he gave that great speech.
Sometimes he did. I think
Mm-hmm.
we have to be historically honest here. He had his racial preference and quota ideas at various times too. So he's a mixed bag. I think we should say a little bit more about George Schuyler. So again, Jonathan knows considerably more than I do, but he wrote a novel in which So first of all, he wrote a very interesting autobiography, Black and Conservative, which I recommend. And I can remember in my youth going to a certain ultra-conservative bookstore in San Francisco, the like of which you could never find today, where they sold this book, and reading it then and being fascinated. And he also wrote a novel, though, in which a formula is invented and Blacks can turn themselves into whites. And so it's pretty interesting because they find that it doesn't.
The novel is entitled Black No More. I've used that with my students. He wrote it in 1931 and sort of set at the end of the Roaring '20s.
Yeah.
And what would happen if race disappeared, if an African American doctor comes up with a process to make darker skin white, all hell breaks loose. The Southern racists, the Klan is upset.
Right.
A figure that is supposed to be W.E.B. Du Bois. His name is Shakespeare Agamemnon Beard. I mean, it's just, Marcus Garvey is a character named Sandtop Licorice.
Lots of fun stuff.
It's a rollicking satire of race relations.
The whites can't figure out who they should be discriminating against, who they should be looking down on anymore. The blacks, the newly transformed blacks, can't. They think it was going to solve all their problems. They find they still have problems that human beings have. So Schuyler was, a critic again of race pride and viewing race is the be-all to end-all, and is a very interesting figure in
And the
this
book
regard.
ends with the marriage of a formerly black man and his southern white wife, and they have a child. And it's a happy ending. The child is mixed, of course, right?
Right.
And this is going to be the future. Now, Schuyler, here's an interesting fact about Schuyler. He married a Texas beauty queen and heiress, a white woman. And they had a child named Philippa, who had, I think, one of the highest IQs on record. She played the violin at 8 or 9 on the radio. And Schuyler's doing his work for the NAACP during that time period. He wrote a pamphlet called "The Racial Intermarriage in America: Most Interesting Phenomena," and he makes the case that Americans, white and black, are so mixed up. It's a myth of color purity.
Right.
The Nazis take wind of this book, which came out in 1929, and they say, see, there are people in America thinking that blacks and whites they have been intermarrying, and they think that's a good thing. Of course, from the Nazi point of view, it isn't. So George Schuyler he could really push buttons, but he was a wickedly good writer. He got in trouble in the King years because he was no fan of King. He felt that King, especially coming to the North, his constant demonstrations were going to elicit rising expectations that couldn't be met, and that there would be unrest. Soon after King received the Nobel Prize, there were riots in northern cities. But Schuyler was, for a time, written out of a black memory because he was opposed to King.
Right.
He's been rediscovered from the 1990s onward because of his novels. But again, like Zora Neale Hurston, people who write forwards.
Say something about Ishmael Reed and Schuyler.
I'll let you do that.
Oh, come on, man. This is your area. So Ishmael Reed is a Berkeley area black novelist, very kind of innovative in his style of writing. He would call it gumbo or something like that. So he has all sorts of interesting novels, including one that's a just devastating parody of the Black Panther Party. And so he interviewed Schuyler very seriously and treated him with great respect and was interested in what he had to say. And Jonathan, you add some more about it.
I think that interview was in a collection on Schuyler that came out 15 or 20 years ago when there was renewed interest in Schuyler. He's really an interesting and forgotten figure. But above all, I would recommend that viewers pick up Black No More. You can buy it at Amazon, of course. It's a short novel. It's just wonderful.
Well, I think we can turn to some of the contemporary people that have been alive in our lifetime now. I don't know who you want to talk about.
Exactly, because I'm thinking that when we move to our own lifetime, we find that a number of key African-American writers and leaders have picked up upon the themes of self-reliance, race indifference, you might say, or color blindness, if you'd like that term, and equality under the law, which had roots and antecedents in earlier African-American leaders. So I'm thinking of Walter Williams, who just died this year, did he not?
Yes.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about him, Jonathan.
Well, Walter Williams was a very popular economist, writer. He's got an entry in my book in which he argues that the government isn't going to be the solution to Black problems. Many of the problems Black America faces are because of government. And he points out things like occupational licensing laws and minimum wage laws, which price unskilled, particularly young Blacks, out of the market.
Right. So he wrote The State Against Blacks, which is all about this. And he very importantly wrote a report for Congress on youth and minority unemployment, which is exactly what Jonathan is just talking about, how devastating the minimum wage is, so that, the whole thing about careers is climbing a ladder. if you cut off the bottom rungs of the ladder by the minimum wage compulsorily on employing blacks, they can't get a leg up because they can't contribute. So paying people is based on their marginal value productivity. And if they're not adding enough to the product or service that the company is making, then they can't profitably employ them. And so, the minimum wage causes, especially young blacks who combine the features of youth and minority, to be unemployed and not too healthy for crime and unrest either.
There's
so
evidence
he was
that
very, very in the forefront of discussing that issue.
there's evidence, historical evidence, that high minimum wage laws were designed to have that effect.
Right.
That's
right.
Progressive economists in the early 20th century, they were
Admitted it.
raging against undesirable workers who were undercutting what the unions call the white man's living wage.
Exactly.
And it was also aimed at Eastern Europeans, Italians. A minimum wage would stop these people from coming to America because
And stop Southerners from moving to the North too.
Stop Southerners from moving to the North, because the thinking was if the minimum wage is that high and employers have to be more selective, they will pick white native-born workers over immigrants or blacks.
Right.
So there's a Thomas Leonard has a book, Illiberal Reformers, and progressives were very determined to price undesirable blacks and new immigrants out of the labor markets, and they were also big fans of eugenics, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, notice that this history of the racial origins of the minimum wage movement,
You won't find it in any textbooks.
and it certainly puts the finger on governmental control as the culprit rather than the savior in the question of equality.
Well, this is a very complicated thing that economists argue over. So let's say, I mentioned earlier that a bunch of New Deal programs were designed so that blacks would not benefit. Well, it's possible that those New Deal programs didn't make all that much of a difference, or some of them might have even been counterproductive for prosperity. So we can't just on the face of it say they held blacks back. Maybe other things held blacks back. This is a very complicated issue, but certainly the intentions of a lot of the progressives and the New Dealers was to retard black progress.
Can either of you tell me a little bit about Thomas Soule?
Well, his office used to be down the corridor from me when I was at the Hoover Institution. He's he's one of the most productive scholars in America. He's very old now, so he's kind of mostly retired, almost completely retired. Although he just had a brilliant book on charter schools. So Soule, I almost never saw him, sometimes on a Saturday. He lived farther north in the San Francisco Peninsula and worked from home. And he had staff at Hoover Institution who would bring him stuff and get library books for him or whatever. And so he first became well known he started out as a Marxist, and he gradually evolved from studying under people like George Stigler and whatever into a classical liberal / conservative. And in some of his earlier books, such as his book on Marxism and his book on Say's Law, I think probably if he were writing them now, they would be better. I mean, I'm not saying there's nothing good in them, but they could be better. He became really well known because of two things. One, he wrote about college admissions. And he wrote a thing saying that the college admissions directors are looking for authentic ghetto youth instead of looking for scholarly blacks who could definitely handle the curriculum and lessons and homework and so forth in college. They were looking for authentic ghetto youth. And the second thing that he became famous for early on was he was a professor at Cornell when there was a black takeover of some buildings. And he said, this is a diversion from the hard work that college students should be doing. And I don't agree with the demands either. And he was, of course, a young black intellectual, and so he had a bit of a megaphone to talk about it. But he proceeded to have a huge volume of work on racial preferences, quotas, caste systems, things like this, where and showing, first of all, that they were all over the world. Secondly, that they're not really all that helpful. Maybe, some upper class blacks benefit from them, but in terms of advancing the rest of society and advancing the bulk of blacks, they're not really very helpful at all. And he really did excellent work on this. He wrote in a wide variety of areas. He even wrote introductory textbooks on economics, and he had a conservative side to him, but I think that I've summed up the essence of his work.
And of course, he was a public intellectual, widely syndicated. We can link him to a new generation of people like Coleman Hughes, who's got a long, glowing account of Thomas Soule, and he also has one of Walter Williams, and the influence that they've had on him. And Coleman Hughes is a recent graduate of Columbia. He's spoken out against reparations at the Congress. He has a wonderful podcast called Conversations with Coleman. And, like Soule, he looks at data, and he questions whether disparities are necessarily ipso facto racism. Thomas Soule has had an influence on younger, contrarian black thinkers like Coleman Hughes, Camille Foster, and others.
Very, very intriguing.
So this issue of disparities is hugely important because, so suppose you found that lots of Mohawk Indians were in construction work in New York City.
And you would.
Which happens to be true. Is this because of racial discrimination? Did somebody Shanghai them up in northern New York and force them to go work on these buildings? No. And so, Soule writes about stuff like that. Why are there so many German generals? There's something to it. Eisenhower, not a Chinese name, it's a German name. And, he goes through all this stuff. It's very interesting what he tries to look at.
If we fast forward to some other figures, just kind of toward the end here, I'm thinking that we don't want to mention some of the, here's Shelby Steele's book, A Dream Deferred. I was going to go then also, having spoken a little bit about race preferences and affirmative action and so forth with Soule's work, I'm thinking of practitioner statesmen like Clarence Thomas and Ward Connerly. Clarence Thomas, of course, is probably the most stalwart defender of individual liberty constitutionalism on the current court. And he comes, therefore, from a long line, both of Americans and of African Americans specifically. Then there's Ward Connerly. There's a great section in your book about him. Tell us a little bit about his campaign against affirmative action, Jonathan.
Well, I guess Bill is continuing this campaign. He might be able to chime in on what Ward and Ron Unz started in the 1990s. Connerly was on the Board of Regents of the University of California system, and he came to understand that there was great discrimination against candidates or applicants who were not Black or Hispanic, and there was great preference in favor of Black and Hispanics. Of course, the group that lost out very heavily were the Asians. So it wasn't a simple black-white situation. Now, this violated his sense of colorblindness, or just the golden rule. And he starts a campaign which became known as the Proposition 209 initiative to amend the California Constitution. And what he did was really brilliant. And he does this in later years in, I think, 4 or 5 other states. He took the language, he and Ron Unz and others took the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which by the 90s was meaningless because the courts and bureaucrats had made equality mean preference. They used the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 And with a little addition, they say that the state of California cannot discriminate or grant preference to anyone based on race, color, creed, national origin, and sex. It was ratified 54% in favor, 46% against, over the opposition of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, big business, the media. So it was really telling that there was still classical liberal colorblind impulse, even in a state like California. And in 2020, there was a move to repeal Proposition 209. Proponents of Proposition 16, which would have repealed the 1990s colorblind amendment. They thought this was the ideal time with Black Lives Matter, concern with race equity and so forth.
Right.
And yet, 57% of Californians voted not to repeal the amendment. So there was a higher, higher than in 1996.
I was part of this effort against Proposition 16. I did a video for it, and I have to say that campaign of opposing Proposition 16 was a grassroots, no money campaign. It got its message out. It was very deftly done, but the establishment was pretty much all against it. And yet the public still does not like the idea of government enforced racial preferences. So in addition to Ward Connerly, you mentioned another individual practitioner.
Well, I mentioned Clarence Thomas.
Oh, so actually this is an interesting thing. So I was talking to Clarence Thomas. I don't talk to him every day, but I was talking to him.
Every other day.
No. But anyway, I was talking to him, and I was explaining that I was doing research about the Wilson administration and how they were, how they had wanted not to have blacks have an academic education. And so he starts chiming in. He knew tons of details about this and who the main figures were on each side and what they'd argued for. I was stunned because it's not something that really comes up in the normal run of, Supreme Court research. He's not going to be footnoting to this topic. He knew all about it, and completely accurately and subtly. I was very, very impressed. And I also would recommend his autobiography, My Grandfather's Son or something like that.
Yeah,
it is
amazing.
a terrific read.
Mm-hmm.
It's an unputdownable book. Actually, several of these people have written some amazing things. Soule has some letters and other autobiographical stuff that's also very compelling. Zora Neale Thurston's autobiography is very compelling. And we mentioned Schuyler's autobiography. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff. Okay, a few final quick takes here. Now, this is going to be unfair to the issues I'm going to raise, but so what would Frederick Douglass say about the 1619 Project of the New York Times? For it or against it?
Well, I believe he would be against it. Not only because in their follow-up curriculum they did not include him. It's certainly a selective rendering of history, but it leaves out the founding documents that he thought were so important. And it preaches white guilt and the need for white/government paternalism to solve the ills of Black America, which of course he as a self-help advocate would disagree with. And so I think for those reasons, Frederick Douglass would be opposed to the account of U.S. history that 1619 Project puts forward.
Okay, here
I would just throw in one last thing about, we could go on for hours about the 1619 Project, but one egregious error in it is that it overweights the supposed contribution of slavery and slave economics to the economic growth of the United States. In fact, it may have been a retardant. And so anyway, they want to claim, well, capitalism is a product of slavery, rather than that slavery was an undercutting, capitalism was undercutting of slavery.
Right. In fact, ultimately, that seemed to be the case. kind of make that very contemporary, there's Ibram Kendi, who says, he's the author of How to Be Anti-Racist. Everyone's reading him these days.
Horrible book.
Yeah, he says, capitalism is essentially racist. Racism is essentially capitalist. What would, let's say, T.R.M. Howard say to Ibram Kendi about capitalism and racism, Jonathan?
Well, T.R.M. Howard he was a black doctor and owned and operated businesses. He too would be, he's a maverick. I think his biographer, David Beto, describes him as a black maverick. He's all over the place. He also ran an abortion clinic, which he profited from at a time when, I think abortion might even have been illegal. I think he began it in the pre-Roe v. Wade. He's big on gun rights. In fact, to such a degree, he would go to Africa for big game hunts. Very controversial, but he was the one that brought to light the Emmett Till horror,
Right.
and led the demand for the investigation over the kidnapping and murder of Emmett Till.
Murder and mutilation.
And he made tons of money as a businessman.
Yes.
Yes.
And advocated black business success as the route to, influence and success in life. He didn't seem to think that capitalism was essentially racist.
No, a lot of these people, Booker T. Washington was the inspiration for people like Johnson, the publisher of Ebony and Jet, or of A.G. Gaston. We all know of Bull Connor and the horrible racism of Birmingham, Alabama. There was a black businessman named A.G. Gaston, had a 6th grade education. He read Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery many times. He ends up owning a motel, I think a number of other businesses, bank, and worth $150 million in one of the most racist environments in the South in the 1960s. So we shouldn't underestimate, the coercion against blacks, particularly state coercion, was really severe. Robert Higgs has a book called Competition and Coercion. I mean, it was a terroristic state of affairs for a long part of Southern history. But there were always areas where there was competition. White landowners would compete to get good, hardworking blacks, and then they would often, in places like...
That's right. In fact, I had an ancestral relative who had a raid night. He had a farm in southwestern Alabama, and he had a school for newly emancipated blacks. This is the late 1860s. And so in 1871, he was attacked by night raiders because competing farmers and people thought that because he had a school and because he treated the blacks properly, he was out competing them. So they took his schoolmaster out, was a young man from Ohio, and whipped him 150 times naked in the forest, told him he had to get out of town. And then they went in and spit tobacco juice, chewing tobacco juice, on the bedroom floor of his wife's bedroom. And so anyway, people didn't like competition. One of the things is they tried to stop the physical mobility of blacks by outlawing labor agents who could, if there were jobs in one place and black workers in another place, they would try and arrange to get the black workers to the jobs. And, the farmers and former plantation owners and stuff didn't want the blacks moving around. They wanted them sticking there and accepting their fate rather than trying to advance themselves. So they outlawed labor agents. This is a very kind of monstrous thing that was going on. So this is all part and parcel of what Jonathan here is saying about how the economy and politics interact in terms of the fate of blacks and the achievements of blacks.
Property rights, free labor, free exchange, they will almost always tend toward the advancement of justice and equality, especially for those who have been systematically coerced by the state. When the state's power recedes and property rights arise under the rule of law, people are going to be better off, and things like racism are going to have a harder time. Finally, here's a provocation. We don't have to go long on this, but I can't fail to mention that President Biden has just rescinded the former order from former President Trump forbidding the use of critical race theory for diversity seminars in federal agencies. Can we glean any wisdom from African American leaders in the past regarding whether the federal government should be requiring people to undergo training in critical race theory in federal agencies? Any wisdom from the past on that kind of topic?
Where do you start? So I mean,
I know
the people in Race and Liberty, Douglass, Miller, Hurston, NAACP leaders, Ward Connerly. I mean, a lot of people who are liberals in the Black tradition, and others who are with the Republican Party. Racial classification, racial thinking, racial typecasting was a thing to be abhorred. And I've had to sit in some of these critically race-influenced diversity training sessions. They now call them. They've moved from diversity training to anti-racism training. They're getting bolder, and you may hear in the media some of the horror stories. Coca-Cola just leaked that you try to be less white. And well, that's influenced by Robin DiAngelo. And you will be given reading lists to read this woman's dreadful book on white fragility, or Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he's got a new book, How to Raise an Anti-Racist Baby. It's all about massive restriction of people's liberty, compelled speech. I don't know where to begin with that. It's a very disturbing trend. There's a chilling effect now, just as there was in the Jim Crow South, when whites like Bill's ancestor perhaps.
And famously, before the Civil War, abolitionist literature was not allowed through the mails in the South. So it's kind of similar to that.
People would be canceled. People are being canceled now. So I don't know whether to analogize it to
leftists are being canceled. So Democratic Socialists of America had a meeting proposed, and they were going to have a Marxist scholar come in. But then Marxism is all about workers and labor. Technically, it's not really supposed to be about race, although that's been added by a bunch of people lately. Point is, this guy was a classic Marxist. He didn't like that. And so they were going to let this guy speak. Some of the other members found out that this guy thought workers of the world unite, not oppressed races of the world unite. So they disinvited him. They had to cancel him, even though he was more communist even than they were. Kind of a weird world out there.
Graham, and to your point, I mean, this is a trend that's going to continue until people stand up.
Yeah.
Now, I understand why very many people are not standing up, because they're fearful, and they're rightfully fearful. There are people like John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry who've got a podcast on Blogging Heads.
They're both excellent and courageous.
But frankly, they're African American, and they've learned to be contrarian. It's more difficult for people who aren't African American to speak up against this. But that being said, tenure is here for a reason, and it's disillusioning that there are so many people, many races that I know, who are fearful. They're very disturbed by this mind-numbing simplification and racial thinking, but they don't want to say anything. So it'd be interesting to see at what point people will stand up and speak. So far, there's no sign of it at all.
We need more. I mean, one thing I'd like just to point out is that we have provided some resources here on this incredible reading list on race and civil rights by our own Bill Evers here, which gives you a remarkable reading list on race and civil rights issues, many things of which we've mentioned already in this. See, it just goes on and on. But
it's a wonderful list.
It's a really wonderful list. You can equip yourself.
It includes some things. It includes some book reviews of some of the books that we've just mentioned that contain this critical race theory, some debunking book reviews, and it presents the real history, and it includes things by Jonathan. So that's all to the good.
So in the face of the rise of sort of racially rationalized coercion, both public and private, people need to know. They need to understand the idea systems and the history, and that's why we give you these resources. That's why we're doing today's broadcast. And also, I think it's very important in order to be prepared to stand for the same principles that our African American forebears stood for, it's important to recognize that we all are heirs and indebted to some of the great figures in American history that we've been admiring and remembering today, because they can fortify us even against some of the stuff that's done in the name of anti-racism, because they stood for, this great line of thinkers at least, stood for the principle that each person is equal, created equal, that the constitutional system is a vindication and protection ultimately for liberty and equality and justice. Let's take our bearings from some of these great figures, African American figures in American history, and fortify ourselves. That's my thought for the day. And with that, if I may, draw us to a close and give thanks, particularly to Jonathan Bean for taking time out from his busy time as a professor of history. Thank you, Dr. Bean.
Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm really grateful. And also to my colleague, Dr. Bill Evers. Thank you, Bill, for your philosophical and historical insights, too. It's really helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan.
And to everybody who's been with us today through thinkspot.com, our ongoing partners in this effort, we're grateful to them, grateful to everybody who joined us through our YouTube page, through our Facebook channel, through our Instagram channel. Lots of people are getting some information and some new insights through this. And we thank you for joining us. We invite you to always return for more resources to independent.org on the web, and join us next time for Independent Outlook. Thanks, everybody.